I'll tell you who I am, then I'll get started. I'm Rachel DeLue. I'm a professor in the Department of Art and Archaeology, and I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening and to be introducing our distinguished speaker. But before I do that, I want to say a word of thanks to both the Department of Art and Archaeology and the Institute for Advanced Study for sponsoring the lecture series, Art and Its Spaces, of which tonight's event is a part. And I should particularly thank Eva Lambois and Nathan Arrington for spearheading the collaborative effort this year. And I also want to make note of the wonderful fact that tonight's lecture has been generously sponsored by the Dr. S.T. Lee Fund for Historical Studies, and we're of course very grateful for that support. Now, this evening we will have the pleasure of hearing from Martha Ward, who is a professor of art history at the University of Chicago and a specialist within the fields of 19th and 20th century art. And as some of you probably know, her interests are wide-ranging and her scholarship has been deeply influential within the field of modern art history. For instance, her book, Pissarro, Neo-Impressionism and the Spaces of the Avant-Garde, counts as essential reading for scholars of the 19th century, not just 19th century art, but the 19th century more broadly. And also it counts as essential reading for anyone who seeks an integration or a model of the integration of close, intimate looking at works of art and razor-sharp analysis of the social, economic, institutional, and critical fabric of which these works of art were a part. Professor Ward's consideration in the Pissarro book of how artists and works of art respond to conditions of display, use, and circulation reflects a larger interest on her part in the history of reception, exhibitions, and museums, and the entanglement of pictorial and art critical practice. And I won't spend too much time listing her CV for you today, but publications and works in progress include writing on the exhibition of modern art, and this includes a groundbreaking and, for me, very important essay on, and for many other people as well, very important essay on impressionist installations and private exhibitions, work on journalistic art writing in the late 19th century in France, an essay in the collection The Lure of the Object on the provocation of particular modes of viewing and encountering as compelled by graphic arrangement or installation display in France in the 1930s, and a current book in progress on Vuillard, the Nabi, and exhibition practice. And I should say that such work poses fundamental challenges to the manner in which scholars in the discipline of art history approach and understand their objects of study, myself included, and this work has opened up truly new and truly rich terrain for all of us. And I hope that Marty will be pleased to know that the Lure of the Object essay was particularly helpful to me and showed me a way forward when I was attempting to come to terms with a very strange set of assemblage sculptures created by the American modernist Arthur Dove. And I also hope she doesn't mind if I include here a personal note before getting on with the show, and I will get on with the show, not to worry. I had the great good fortune of being a student of Marty's at Johns Hopkins when she was there visiting for, I think it was, a year, and I did my graduate work at Hopkins, and I took a seminar with her. And when I describe effective graduate teaching to my students now, and when I attempt it myself in the classroom, an image of Marty at the seminar table in Mergenthaler Hall on the Hopkins campus comes to mind. And I don't exaggerate when I say that I still today draw on her example of pedagogical engagement in my own teaching and advising. And I should also say that I would be happy to come even a little bit close to emulating her combination of intellectual rigor, inspirational teaching, and generous mentorship. My first job, in fact, out of graduate school was a teaching position at Chicago, and it was a true delight, A, to have a job, thanks in no small part to Marty's efforts, and B, to be in her immediate orbit once again, especially as a young scholar endeavoring to find her way. That would be me, the young scholar, and in need of guidance and sound advice, which Marty was always wonderful about providing. So on with the show. Professor Ward's talk this evening draws on a current book project, a book entitled The Art Show, which is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press next year. And as she described it to me, the study examines changes in curatorial practice, primarily at the Louvre, in the 1920s and the 1930s in light of different media concerns, especially reproductive photography and film. So please join me in welcoming Professor Martha Ward, who will speak to us this evening on Crowded Walls, 20th Century Nostalgia for 19th Century Installation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was incredibly generous. Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay. So I want to thank Evelyn, the Institute, and the Department of Art History and Archaeology for inviting me here, and especially Rachel. Thank you so much for that generous, incredibly generous introduction. Okay. I think we're ready to go. How did viewers look at paintings under these conditions? From its beginnings and throughout the 19th century, the Paris Salon and much of the Louvre displayed works that stretched from below waist height to near ceiling level. Large pictures were canted outwards, high on the wall. There was no possibility of standing squarely in line with their perspectives. Smaller pictures placed lower might be taken in more head-on, and their surface crafting might be available to be appreciated, but the viewer would still see them against the peripheral ground of adjacent works. As for the wall as a whole, some principles of decorative harmony might be employed, with works of similar size, style, and subject being made into pendants and used to flank larger pieces. But at other places, there was what now looks like simple chock-a-block. As a student of 19th century reception, I've long felt that our inability to take these conditions into account seriously, that is, to be able to imagine how they might actually have informed or shaped ways of looking at the art, is a significant problem. To be sure, there were jokes and complaints about visibility, like the cartoon on the title page for my PowerPoint, but the fact is that on some level, such displays were widely accepted as simply being the way things were done. Year after year, the same formats were used. It's sobering to think that the vast majority of the most famous of 19th century contemporary works and of works from the past were seen, evaluated, and remembered as they appeared in these conditions and these alone. Not a lot about installations in big venues began to change until the century's end, and a thoroughgoing overhaul occurred only when a host of factors, among them contemporary artist practices, advertising innovations, perceptual psychology research, and new notions of the public, led in the first third of the 20th century to the widespread adoption of the spare installation that now seems so normal. A painting hung roughly at eye level so that the individual viewer can situate himself directly in front of it. Now, I don't have answers to the questions with which I've begun this talk, but today I want to take a backwards perspective and explore not how 19th century viewers may have experienced such walls, but rather what was missed by some once these displays were on the wane. These concerns surface especially in commentaries by Louvre curators in the 1920s and 30s. Theirs was perhaps a classic case of not knowing what you've got until it's gone. But at the same time, we find some among them reviving and repurposing the model of the densely hung installation so as to accommodate new forms of art history and notions of viewership. And these curators were all involved in one way or another with more fundamental issues, including the nature of memory, comparison, and association, that were a paramount concern in museum circles engaged in trying to implement more rigorous art historical notions into displays in the 1930s. In short, this nostalgia was very much a product of its time. Still, on the face of it, the Louvre in the 1920s and 30s seems a most unlikely place to find nostalgia. Full-scale modernization was underway, and rather urgently so. By this time, it had become amply clear that not only the Louvre, but most French museums had failed to keep pace in the escalating international competition that had begun around 1900 and escalated after World War I to clean up museums, prune collections, and make contents more comprehensible. France had been a leader in efforts to coordinate museum policies across countries after World War I, with the International Office of Museums being established in Paris in 1926. And you see here its flagship journal, Museum, which was published in Paris and regularly turned out articles advocating best practices for a range of very practical subjects affecting public museums like catalogs, education, storage, use of reproductive photographs. Ironically, though, what this early leadership in the standardization of museums practices may most have given to the local community was a well-informed awareness of its own backwardness. Henri Verne, director of the National Museums from 1926 to 1939, established a vast and ambitious plan for redoing the Louvre's installations. Fundamentally, this involved reconceptualizing presentation for a mass public. It was a project that particularly interested Verne, whose commitments to popular education dated back to early in the century when he'd been involved with the Paris Université Populaire, had studied German and British educational programs, and had particularly admired British lending libraries. The important point for us is that Verne was particularly concerned with how to get viewers not only to look at works, but with how to remember them, how to get viewers to remember them. He drew upon notions and resources provided by other media, the book, the photograph, and even cinema, with which the novice viewer should be familiar. Verne wrote in 1928 that the rearrangement of the collections that was then beginning to get underway would mean that the museum would transition from being, quote, a dictionary, transition away from being a dictionary. The implication was that it had been a repertory system for an elite who could catalog in hand, access definitions to broaden their art historical vocabularies. Instead, as chaotic, crowded rooms gave way to one-row hangs, the installation was to provide a narrative progression that would seem more like a novel, he said. The history of eras and schools would be represented through the sequencing of rooms with well-paced episodes and engaging characters. Chronology would be respected as much as was possible, given the constraints of the old palatial structure. Moreover, the viewer should be able to anticipate what was coming in the rooms ahead and to recall what he had been led to see. In 1935, the Guide par l'image, a slim brochure featuring tiny reproductive photographs of famous works and designed to serve as a roadmap, appeared. Verne explained in the preface that the Guide par l'image was to provided photographs to initiate one into the art of looking at works of art. Each page should provide a quick resume of a period. At a glance, the visitor could see star works, the vedettes, scan the neighboring columns of text, and know what to look for. It was designed to make works recognizable, to make comparisons among works easy, and the photographs were also to be used retrospectively to help in remembering what one had seen and in expanding one's range of taste. And this is another project that Henri Verne helped bring into being. It's at the other end of the spectrum, a very, very deluxe set of volumes with gorgeous héliogravures produced by the photographer André Vigneux. Now, Verne put enormous faith in the power of reproductive photography to introduce the viewer to art objects and to educate him well beyond that introduction. Indeed, without knowing it, he would seem to have been in agreement with his Paris contemporary at the time, Walter Benjamin, who recorded in his 1930 diary a conversation with bookseller Adrien Monnier, in which they agreed that the work of art was somehow easier to grasp in a photograph. In reducing its size, eliminating 3 dimensions, selecting one or several viewpoints, modulating differences in textures, materials, and colors, the photograph effaced some properties, abstracted others, and brought still others into prominence. In Verne's accounts, photographs were what made it possible for visitors to carry works through the museum not only on paper, but also in their heads, he wrote. In their reductiveness and standardization, reproductive photographs provided images that were easy to recall, and they made it easier to understand that the ability to recognize a masterpiece as if at first glance and to recollect its appearance for comparative or associative purposes were fundamental art historical skills. These were basically the same skills being developed elsewhere through deluxe illustrated books and slide lectures, and though with more substantial content and perhaps directed at already sophisticated taste. Now, just as the new Louvre signaled its stars for the mass public through miniaturized photographs that greatly reduced the qualities to be attended to and thus made the works readily graspable, so it aggrandized many of the actual objects in the museum, highlighting certain features and making works seem to be more than themselves, to be spectacular. Famous works were set apart, put against bare walls, with vistas cleared for approaching them without peripheral distraction. The installation was designed to enhance their three-dimensionality, tactile appeal, and presence. The new electric lighting that Verne had installed around the stars, often casting dramatic shadows, went against the traditional belief that museum illumination should allow for even visibility and thus for objective viewing, an ideal going back to the Enlightenment. Instead, installation was now designed to allow those who did not know anything about sculpture to experience dramatically, even phantasmatically, its sculpturalness. When the museum began to have evening hours during 1936 and 37, in response to the Popular Front and the need to attract not only a mass public but a working class public, lights in selected museums would occasionally be turned off for a short period of time to produce even more amazement when the works would be suddenly re-illuminated. In all these endeavors, between the miniaturized photographs and the oversized vedettes, between the graspable and the phantasmatic, Verne played media off one another to orchestrate reception. We could say that he endowed the works with a mechanically enhanced or false aura in the very simple colloquial sense of meaning a halo effect, a halo created literally by spotlights and figuratively by the viewer's memory of the work, as shown through reproductive photography. But the more powerful effect must have been generated by manipulating the contrast between photographic reproduction and original's presentation. As the tactile was often de-emphasized in reproduction, then hyper-enhanced through lighting, as point of view was limited in the photograph, then highly choreographed with surprising angles in the approach to the work, as a seemingly knowable object became the overwhelming spectacle. As part now of this general overhaul, many galleries of paintings too were stripped down and rearranged so that famous works might be easily located for recognition on the basis of small photographs and guides. And I chose this view of the installation of the Impressionist paintings, which had just entered the Louvre at this time, having been brought over from the Musée de Luxembourg, because one of the star works is very much of interest to a faculty member in the art history department here, Bridget Altdorf. She couldn't be here, but the Fontaine-Latour was one of the reproduced and focal works here. The visitor could now position himself in front of each painting and, standing close to its surfaces, appreciate it for what the photograph had not been able to convey. Though designed to operate in a different manner than elsewhere in the museum, not through spectacle, but through intimacy, the effect here was intended still to enhance what Benjamin would have called the exhibition value of the works. For this, photography was crucial in Verne's scheme in recasting the object for mass public through manipulations of scale, proximity, and appearance, and through directing the viewer's attention to anticipate and recollect key works. For Verne, this manipulation was a step on the way to the viewer's realizing the work as art historical, meaning its chronological situation and school affinity. Whereas for Benjamin, of course, it would have been but a further erosion of the work's ability to give a sense of its true historicity. Now, no doubt many at the Louvre were not entirely thrilled with the changes Verne implemented in the interest of the public. But the three curators whom I want to discuss today saw more to be at stake than an inevitable and perhaps lamentable popularization. Not that there was anything like radical dissent to Verne's program from within inside the institution. But in various writings and practices by these figures, both at the time and subsequently, their disquiet can be teased out from behind their public face, along with their nostalgia for, perhaps their imagination of, what had been best about the old days. First, the charming and cosmopolitan Georges Sale. Sale entered the Louvre in 1924 and began serving as curator in the Asian department in 1932. He became director of the Musée Guimet in 1941 and ascended to the very top to become director of the Musée de France in 1945. The grandson of Gustave Eiffel Tower, Sales had been reared in close touch with artists. He was close to Matisse and especially to Picasso, and he collected a range of art, as did many of the amateurs in the circles around the Louvre with whom he associated, including Raymond Coquelin, whose model of eclecticism influenced him in bringing together Islamic, Japanese, and Chinese objects with, among others, Impressionist paintings. Sale's personal views are nowhere more strikingly put forth than in his book Le Regard, written through the 1930s and published in 1939. Over the course of this densely metaphorical and archaically phrased book, Sales privileges with extraordinary nuance ways of looking far removed from those being designed at the Louvre. For Sales, looking occurs fundamentally in relation to knowledge and judgment, but it also occurs in relation to settings and places. And those places vary across the chapters of his book. In one chapter, for instance, the viewer is surrounded by his collection at home, lost in undirected reverie. His is a view without thought, completely free, skimming the surfaces of objects before him, while reasoning faculties are quieted in utter abandonment to sensory immediacy. It is the play of sensation that gives coherence and significance to his collection, not any externally based classification. This is one of the points that Benjamin greatly appreciated when he reviewed Sal's book in 1940. Ultimately, for Sal's, this unwilled, undirected gaze is the basis for discovering and expanding the sensory basis in memory that constitutes taste. In another chapter, Sal's is himself a vagabond, wandering streets, casting glances as would a flaneur, bringing into the museum memories of various sites and of modern art seen along the way. The walls of the old Louvre here are figured as an extension of the street, a place for the idle flaneur who allows for the unexpected and forgets his route, whose openness permits him to discover what has heretofore passed undetected or has just now been revealed by a fortuitous passing of a streak of light. Perhaps intentionally, Sal's language calls to mind the late 19th century literary man and collector Edmond de Goncourt, who wrote eloquently about his own vagabonding contemplation, as it was occasioned by the street, by a boutique of bibelots, by the interior where his and his brother Jules' objects were housed. It was aimlessness, chance, and happenstance that appealed both to Edmond de Goncourt and to Sal. Sal ultimately treats the Louvre more as a dwelling space than a public museum. It is a place for intimate discovery. He does not describe the walls of the old Louvre with specificity, and indeed any of the densely hung assemblages from early in the century would seem to illustrate what he valued. In having a seemingly inexhaustible expanse of works to scan, there was also always the possibility for surprise, for sensory awakenings or reawakenings that would happen as if by chance, thus providing the starting point for a flow of memories and associations across the images of art history. As with the personal collection, the externally imposed order of classification matters for little in arrangement here, except as it allows for sensory play, the true basis for Sal's through which taste is to be known, expanded, surprised, and reborn. For Sal's, being able to circulate the eye across the field saturated with canvases initiates a process that is pleasurable, but also profound. One senses, one sees, then judges. Sal's casts the process in language redolent of Proust, where it is sensation that brings forth memory and thus makes an object recognizable or assimilable through the most personal of associations. The impact of a work is instantaneous, but what one also hopes for from looking at works is, as in tasting a good meal, the, quote, poetic prolonging of organic play, end quote, by which Sal's means sustained sensorial engagement. Jean-Louis Deotte has provided a vivid, perhaps an overly vivid, account of Sal's aesthetics by which sensation is transformed by memory into recognition. Quote, "The eye senses its prey before identifying it. The swiftness of its reflex indicates that its memory is playing independently of other slower memory by which each object will be isolated from its neighbors and then will be found to offer a cue for recognition. The sensation of color orients us instantaneously, a vibration which will awaken in us a decisive echo. We feel before looking, even before seeing," end quote. Skimming and scanning, sensing and focusing are essential to this process of looking at paintings. So too is the feeling that one can, as it were, see a painting distinguishing itself as a discrete material object to be focused upon from within a broader field. But for Sal's, the relationship between sensation, materiality, and memory in museum display is more complicated than this. For just as an informal amassing of work is conducive to the flow of the gaze and to the imagination, so to the exercise of involuntary memory, so a highly staged presentation through the one-row hang is for Salz more than simply overly directive and restrictive. So what you see here, and the relevance of this will become clear in a minute, is a little maquette that was actually made by, probably not by the curators at the Louvre, but by workmen at the Louvre under their direction for an installation on museology in 1937. And it strikes me that it shows the Boymans in a way that Salz would have appreciated. Consider Salz's remarkable commentary on Rotterdam's Boymans Museum, one of the new white cube constructions of the 1930s, and an example of what French museologists at this time called a clinic museum. For Salz, the museum has a curious effect of insulating and even seeming to want to protect the viewer from the paintings. Similarly sized and set far apart in a one-row hang, the Boymans paintings appear to him to be absorbed into the wall itself, such that nothing would risk bumping or jostling the viewer in his space. The specifics of the architecture count for nothing, for they too are stripped down and regularized. The Boymans paintings have been lined up across this surface, and for Salz the result is a loss in their materiality. A paradox emerges. For even as the one-row hang positions a painting to facilitate a one-on-one relationship with the viewer, that painting can also be said from Salz's perspective to lose in specificity by being made one in a row. What should, according to the installation's logic, be experienced as the particularity of the single object before one becomes instead for Salz an experience of the sameness of one's positioning in front of each work, and of the sameness of every work's placement on the wall. Now, Salz contrasts the spare plains of the Boymans with the crowded corners of Paris's Musée des Arts Décoratifs and the overcharged walls at The Hague's Merit Suisse. In these, each work is part of a profuse ensemble, which means that the work can also become special in itself. These are displays that offer resistance to the viewer, a resistance that Salz sees to be productive in charging the relationship between viewer and object. When everything is neither at eye level nor presented evenly against the flat plane of a wall, the viewer is inconvenienced. He has to take the first step of wanting to see, of pursuing the sensation that leads him to the painting and to viewing it as a material thing positioned in space. The Proustian Salz also must mean to suggest here that an object's resistance to being seen thus ensures that, for the viewer, the sensations will be remembered as having occurred at a specific place from the embodied position that is a particular vantage point. The problem with the Boymans, then, is that it makes viewing too easy, and that risks leaving its art forgotten. Salz's preference for having a sense that in order to see a painting fully, one had to experience endeavoring to do so, would also seem, in part at least, to account for other of his enthusiasms. These include experiments in art history exhibitions with easels, such as the Titian show in Venice in 1935, of which we unfortunately have no images. That was a display that Salz also greatly appreciated for its for its informality and lack of categorization. It's fairly amazing to think of a Titian show with many of the works on easels. Now, showing works on easels was a popular enough practice in late 19th century private collections, as with the Degas here in the Isaac de Camondo interior in Paris in the late 1890s. As an initial field to take in as sensation, the scattering into depth of variously canted surfaces to be scanned and skimmed might well have appealed to Salz. But easel display also provided in an extraordinary way that here-ness and now-ness to approaching and viewing the painting as a material object that seems to have been a crucial first step for Salz on the way to fully apprehending the individuality of the work. I apologize for the poor quality of this image. It's from a newspaper. One has to take these installation shots where they can be found. In Le Regard and other contemporaneous writings, without saying as much, Salz seems to suggest that the Louvre's new installations, which were standardizing and spectacularizing in an effort to make the art memorable, was not making it memorable in the way that would or should count. For Salz, the memories that mattered were those that issued from encounters with works that seemed unstaged and unpredictable. That, for him, was the crux of the problem. For curator Germain Bazin, writing privately at the time and more publicly in later articles, the adoption of a one-row installation at the Louvre was also somewhat regrettable, but for different reasons. A student of medievalist Émile Malle at the Sorbonne, Bazin also had a degree from the École du Louvre, the traditional training ground for French curators. He officially joined the Louvre in 1937, though he'd worked there in prints and drawings throughout the 30s. During this decade, he researched a variety of subjects, but central to much of his thinking was Latin American Baroque art. He also prepared an extensive history of art museums, initially delivered as lectures at the École du Louvre before the war and published only in the 1960s, although it's very fortunate that the manuscript notes for those lectures survive. It was especially in his later writings, some even from the 1980s, that Bazin sought to evoke nostalgically his youth. The time at the Louvre, he said, when the gaze was not to be trained on the individual work or along a single line of them. Remembering back to an unspecified time, which we should probably locate in the late 1910s, perhaps early 20s, he spoke of a generation of amateurs that used to come in the mornings to traverse the Louvre looking across walls chock full of paintings in the hopes of cultivating and maintaining their eye. Given this reference to connoisseurship, it's clear that part of what Bazin missed from those days was simply having a lot on view. Having a range of works by familiar and unfamiliar painters with works of varying quality, widely variable quality, provided more opportunities for cultivating one's eye. But there was more than this to Bazin's nostalgia. Quote, "There were few books on art at this time, and not many photographic guides," Bazin wrote, and thus, quote, "one had to develop one's eye according to the works themselves without an image being interposed," end quote. This notion that there had once been a time when the works were somehow to be seen directly as themselves and when one's sensibility would be developed on that basis rather than through prior acquaintance with the reproduction, this was a romanticization of the past on Bazin's part. Reproductive images and photographs of many of the Louvre's works had been long available, in fact, engravings, prints for its whole existence since the Revolution. And photographs had been available close by. The agency Braun even had a room of their own in the Louvre in the early 1880s to sell their reproductive photographs of works in the collection. But aside from there being a time when many less well-known works, less likely to have been photographed, might have been on view, what Bazin also seems to have wanted to evoke was a time when the installation itself did not seem to suggest that each work was to be apprehended as might a photographic reproduction in an art historical text. That is, as guaranteed worthy of study as an illustration of a period, a style, or a concept. Though admittedly elusive, Bazin's point is a bit easier to understand in relation to the German formalism beginning to be introduced into France during the 1930s, with which much later Bazin indirectly associated his remarks. In a peculiar turn of phrase, he wrote that Wölflin's methods, quote, imposed a reading of the work comparable to commentary on a text, end quote. The viewer was to be positioned so as to consider only one work at a time, as one might read only one book at a time. Isolating the work for view entailed reducing it to being only itself, for it was no longer possible to set it at play with a peripheral field of similarity and difference. Yet for Bazin, isolation also meant, following on its association with Wölflin and the development of formalist art history, that the full import of the focused upon work would be foreclosed. For such concentration was understood to be intended to abstract from the work only certain features that would make it readily comparable to others. To put this more simply, Bazin seems to have experienced the spare one-row hang as having a didactic intention. It created a point of view that was understood to invite, perhaps compel, a certain kind of attention subtly to discourage other considerations. With large works like altarpieces and the history paintings that you see here being brought down to eye level, and with every work being placed so as to suggest it should be viewed closely, one was invited to see it in such a way that a set of concerns, planes, lines, finish, etc., Wölflinian categories, could turn the work or the memory of the work into a representative of period style. In addition to this process of abstraction, initiated by the work's isolation from other pieces, its location on the line, and its proximity to the viewer, the installation suggests that the work was best to be known through sustained and solitary engagement. As Bazin put it on another occasion, quote, nowadays the eyes must be able to scan slowly the entire surface of a painting as if to see only that. The act of looking becomes a sort of trance uniting spectator and masterpiece, end quote. In the same passage, he lamented, quote, iconographic meaning, overall harmony, relative size, use, allegorical flourishes, all aspects that might have attracted the 19th century amateur no longer interest the contemporary museum goer who has been led to be obsessed with style, form, and workmanship. There lurks in Bazin's nostalgic recollections the pejorative sense that, on balance, the new ways of installation assumed a kind of formalism and that had the effect of seeming too directive, reductive, and in some fundamental sense, too scripted. It was as if that reduction in the work's possibilities was, for Bazin, somehow comparable to inserting a photographic reproduction between the viewer and the work. That is, to seeing the painting as if only an illustration supporting a concept already worked out in an art historical text. So, if for Bazin, a spare one-row hang directed the viewer's gaze in what seemed too limited and pedagogical a fashion, then for Georges Salle, the same installation seemed to make viewing too easy, too much the same, too forgettable. Though they came from different concerns, what both Bazin and Salles missed was the sense of open-endedness that the crowded hang invited, the possibility to cultivate one's sensibility through vagabonding. Whether for the Proustian Salles or the more iconographically and connoisseurly oriented Bazin, something like the genuineness or the value of the memory of the encounter with a work was at stake, as that might be understood to encompass both the full specificity of the work itself and the particular situatedness of the viewer's relationship to it. So as a final instance of nostalgia that developed as the dense hang was on the wane in the 1930s, I want to consider the rather different case of René Huyghe. Like these others, Huyghe associated the dense freedom with a sense of freedom, the dense hang with a sense of freedom and multifaceted possibility. But he also saw it as a means to facilitate a current form of art history. Huyghe had studied philosophy and aesthetics at the Sorbonne, pursuits that he avidly continued to follow in the 1930s. He also had a degree from the École de Louvre and researched, but never completed, a dissertation on the landscapist Théodore Rousseau. During the 1930s, he served as editor of the art history magazine L'Amour de l'Art. Energetic and precocious, he was the youngest person ever appointed to a curatorship at the Louvre. By 30, he'd been promoted to become head of paintings. And so it's ironic that you should see him as an old man there, but it proved impossible to find a photograph of him alone from the 30s. So an important example of Huyghe's attempts to retool the dense hang in the service of new concerns is provided by his installation at the 1932 Royal Academy of Art show of French art. Though the show was organized by various curators at the Louvre, partnered with English co-sponsors, the installation was given over to the young Huyghe. He labored over it. He deemed the Royal Academy workmen inadequate and had a special French team brought over from the Louvre. You see them here with their berets on. He had some walls reinstalled as many as 8 to 10 times. Because of this show, Huyghe would be remembered as an ideologue in installation practices by some curators, including Paul Alfassa at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. And indeed, some aspects of the display were strikingly odd. Throughout the show was hung fairly densely for the time, with 2 or 3 rows close together. Genres and styles were mixed, and though some walls were centered through symmetrical designs, others were more like open fields with paintings amassed in a flowing or halting fashion. Though the plan in the archives you see here called for a clear chronology, when installed by Huyghe, multiple rooms were actually split between centuries. Others had seepage at the beginnings or endings. Huyghe's notions here would seem to be similar to those expressed later by Henri Feuillon, who wrote that a century-based conception of time, which he identified as his temporal structure of museum architecture, had the unfortunate consequence of molding the past into discrete units rather than allowing for its fluidity to be realized. Moreover, Huyghe obtained special permission to reverse the direction of the traditional Royal Academy exhibition, with the result that the regular visitor, relying on the sense of past visits, might well have entered into the 19th century and proceeded backwards. Of the 9 poussins at the London show, none hung together. Some appeared beside the Lenain, others with Watteau, one with Corot. And Poussin was not alone among major artists in being so dispersed across centuries. 2 years before this show, Huyghe had written about scattering works by a single artist through a roughly chronological exhibition as a means of encouraging what he termed rappel, or recollection. Huyghe intended these rappels to prompt viewers to summon up and entertain their memories from earlier in the show or from elsewhere. The rappel was meant to spark visual imagination, to invite the viewer to engage in a more open-ended or personalized response. As the language I'm using here is meant to signal, Huyghe, like many of his generations, was steeped in the philosophy of Henri Bergson, and his conception of consciousness is based on a sense of temporal fluidity, is based on changing feelings, on interpenetrating images, and on the dynamics of inner experience. In densely hanging the show, in restructuring the correlation of temporality with architectural space and linear sequencing, in scattering works of rappel throughout the show, Huyghe, I think, sought to prompt viewers to recollect their way in a personal fashion through history, and here, to use a language close to his own, to feel free in their own memories and imaginations. There was more to this installation, though, and in this last section, I'm going to try to summarize some rather involved notions quickly. Regarding the commentary that accompanied the show, it becomes clear that such dense hangs as the one you see here that I've reconstructed, and the achronological situating of works also accommodated the primary organizer's intentions, which were, press releases said, to represent the latest in French art history. In fact, most of the art historical interpretations came from Huyg's direct superior at the Louvre, Paul Jameau. Jameau is best known today for collaborating with Charles Sterling at just this time in the rediscovery of the 17th-century painter Georges de la Tour. Jameau was concerned with realism as a continual force in the history of French art, running through it as might a stream. He was also concerned with the nature of the relationship between realism and classicism, and typical of European art history in the interwar period, with questions of indigenous traditions and foreign influences. His model for French art was provided by Corot, in whom he saw a modest or humble classicism and an ability to completely assimilate an Italian tradition to a French landscape. An installation like the one you see here fit with Jameau's sensibilities, with the humility of the Lenin and of Georges de la Tour being set directly adjacent to the classicist Poussin, whose powers of observation and sensual emotionalism were accordingly to be brought forth. In addition to the interrelatedness of classicism and realism, if considered in the art historical positions of Jameau, which Huyg endorsed at this time, the panel also raises issues related to French artists working in Italy and the rise of the Caravaggisti. And I'm not going to work through this here, just suffice it to say that the arrangement is very suggestive in what Jameau will say about the matter in his 1934 book on French painting. Huyg, writing about 17th century art at the show, summed it up thus. French art had been open to neighbors and to influences from the north and south, from Italy and Flanders, but its greatness lay in its ability to achieve an equilibrium that tempered these influences. The savvy viewer to the show was to come away having realized that Poussin and France's classicism were not cold, calculated, and haughty, but modulated with realism, compassion, and even grace. Here's another one of these panels where Poussin here is being recalibrated in view of neighboring pictures, mostly Watteau. What is important for us is that something like the old-fashioned matrix of a decorative ensemble was deployed to enable the multiple connotations and simultaneous comparisons that the organizers wished to foster. Theirs was a history thicker with varying types of analysis and chronologies than was the formalist art history implicit in the one-row hang, which, at least according to Bazin, reduced a painting to planes, forms, and surfaces and periodized pigeonholing. In Huyg's installation, closely hung works were to temper the interpretations of their neighbors to the sides, above and below, along multiple vectors. And though, for the purposes of this presentation, I've divided the installation into seemingly discrete panels, the show itself was not nearly so divided. What was aimed for instead was the sense of a history without rupture or clear periods, but of flows and eddies, disappearances and reappearances, with centrally important artists moving to more marginal positions and then back again. This was certainly a show with a script, in the sense of having an art historical agenda, but it is a show that was to appear unscripted. Instead, one was to come to realize the intermingling of tendencies in French art through the ages, as though experiencing before oneself the flow of the images in one's individual consciousness and memory. So I hope my exploration this afternoon of the nostalgia that Sales, Bazin, and Huyg expressed for the dense hang has, if nothing else, at least convinced you that, at least for some, during a period of time in the 1930s, crowded walls were seen to have advantages. Each of these men was concerned in a different way with how the circumstances in which the viewer came to see a work of art might help to determine the memories the work seemed to call up or to lay down. This preoccupation with the occupations of memory they shared with Henri Verne, as he sought to modernize the Louvre, coupling the ease of locating a work in a spare display with the supposed power of reproductive photography to facilitate recognition and recall, and relying on spectacularizing effects or intimate encounters to make for vivid impressions. In contrast, for our three curators, what came to matter in figuring memorability was the variability and the complexity of what might be required to actually see a work, whether because it was simply so tightly packed with others in a broad field, was hung so high because so big, or so low because so small, or was, as in Huyg's show, so imbricated within a dense matrix of comparison and repetition. Crowded walls meant that the precise situatedness of the painting was to be valued for its ability to charge the memory of the work itself with the specifics of how one had and had not been able to look at it. Faced with the odd combination in the new Louvre of standardization, mediation, and spectacularization, something like the genuineness of the memory of the encounter with a work was at stake for these men. In the end, they valued the overstuffed, heterogeneous walls of the old museum for providing the opportunity to develop what seemed to be authentically one's own taste and sensibility discovered as if by happenstance. How useful this nostalgia is for imagining how actual 19th century viewers might have navigated across the masses of artworks that typified French salons and museums then. How those viewers found satisfying or adequate ways to see works at angles in irregular light against competing neighbors. This is not a question I can address now, nor if I did, could I answer it. But I hope that considering the question from the historical vantage point of the 1920s and 30s, that is, from the perspectives of those in a generation that actually experienced firsthand the great transformation that occurred in installation practices in the first decades of the century, may have opened some issues to pursue another day. I would also hope that by recovering and explicating the vantage point of this generation, a defamiliarizing light might have been thrown upon the spare installation and its dominant interpretations. For art historian Marianne Staniszewski, for example, the design of a subject position that would allow one to situate oneself squarely in front of a single work of art at roughly eye level was fundamental in, quote, the development of a modern subjectivity, end quote, and was designed to magnify a sense of autonomy and individual experience, which then goes on to link very generally with the notion of the self in a modern liberal state. More recently, Charlotte Clonk has more carefully contextualized the development of the sparse display in view of late 19th century interest in psychophysical research, the dynamics of attention, and consumerism. Though more nuanced than Staniszewski, Clonk is ultimately similar in seeing the one-row hang as being a means for cultivating individual subjective experience. In concluding, my purpose in summarizing their concerns here is not to say they are right or wrong. Rather, it is to say that the figures whom we've spent this afternoon considering would beg to differ. For them, the one-row hang risked shutting down the freedom required to cultivate one's individual sensibility, and even more important, to exercise one's memory. Thanks for your attention. Okay. I'm gonna
Questions?
It's okay.
Just, and it may not be a fair question altogether, but to invite you to talk about what happens after 1939. Verne steps down. I presume he retires rather than is removed. Vichy is a regime that has some sympathy at times for nostalgia. Do these men get a chance to enact their agenda in subsequent years?
In 1945, when the pictures are first brought back to the Louvre from wartime storage, Georges Salle and René Huyghe put the show up that is meant to be a temporary installation before a more permanent arrangement can be designed. And it's densely hung, but not with 2 or 3 rows, but the pictures are very close together, and in some places there are 2 hangs. But more importantly, it's a roughly achronological installation that goes much more in the direction of kind of enabling creative comparisons and working against any kind of chronology. And so it's as if after the war, there's this moment where we're going to throw history to the wind and enjoy the art in this very intuitive, associative manner. So it seems appropriate to that moment, but it's also a throwback, I think, to these sentiments from the 30s. After that, it goes into a roughly chronological hang. There are occasions where amateurs' collections get shown in the Louvre, and they'll do a dense hang that's not chronological. But I think after, does that answer your, okay.
Marty, hi. Is this on? Okay, hi. Thank you for this talk, which was extremely suggestive of the various motivations for what seems like a fairly simple solution in terms of the hang. But I found myself at the beginning thinking that we were dealing with a classic example of a kind of French anti-modernism. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of convinced me that maybe there was more to it than that. But I was curious to try to think about how this kind of, is nostalgia the right word for this sort of combination of multiple pictures on the wall? How that might begin to relate to, and I don't know if it does relate to, but how it might relate to much more kind of avant-garde presentations that you're seeing in exhibitions of mass media, like in the German tradition of, Die Presse or Film and Photo, or there's ways in which there are exhibitions that are very much about the new media that, in a sense, are also not about pictures in a row, but are very much taking you up and down the wall and changing scales and in and out. And, where does this, is there a way that this is at all reflective of what's happening with the experience of mass cultural media like those exhibitions?
Not in what I talked about today, but I do think that emerges later. Sometimes works that are put close together that are from different periods, and the notion is that you're going to have associations in connecting them, can look like a more montage-like juxtaposition, but I think that would be somewhat an erroneous connection historically to make at this moment. I do think it comes in practices later. I'm very interested in an exhibition that Huyghe puts on in 1937, which is a very different kind of installation, but he uses photographs in a preparatory section for visitors before they see paintings. And some of those work in a more montage-like manner to sort of spark some way of seeing, if concept is too grand a word for what's at work there. And he was an editor at L'Amour de l'Art and had a huge collection of reproductive photographs that are now at the National Gallery. and was interested in typography and graphic design and some of the stuff that was coming from Germany. Does that...
Yeah, can I have just one quick question?
Sure.
Another thing that seemed to be a kind of notable absence in this is like, where is Malraux in this story?
Well, Malraux was very much how I got into this, actually. So this is just a small part of a bigger book project that looks at the use of the reproductive photography by Verne and by Huyghe in conjunction with Malraux and things after the war. So to be sure, yeah, the idea that photographs revealed the style of the work and reduce a work so that it can be grasped stylistically is not something that Verne articulates as such, but is certainly part of the way that Huyghe is thinking about this already by 1937. That you can, if you can position the right photographs for a viewer to look at before they go into an exhibition, they'll have access to something like style. So that's Malraux in terms of the argument, part of the argument for the Musée Imaginaire, as is implicitly, Verne's argument that what you want to do for the visitor is to load their heads with photographic images, right? It's in the service of a very, very different end than Malraux's, right? But it's the same notion that photography can have a certain power over museums and their collections and how they're looked at.
Thank you very much for making it impossible for me to look at a museum installation again without concentrating on the installation as much as what I'm looking at. But is there a sense in which the curator is exalting the artist, making the curator than the artist? As you've pointed out, the dense hang is to allow free association, but in a very controlled way, ultimately. And one can be very obsessive about what will be put next to other things. And the early pictures, that look like it's size. You cover every inch of the wall in the 19th century with pictures that fit it. That's not what's going on here. So is the curator becoming an artist? And the curator is there a sense that the single hang is simply, anybody could do that, but it takes a great artist to decide what will go in these more complex compositions? Is there any explicit reflection on the skill of the curator in creating this?
That's an interesting question. That's a sort of combination that I associate more with the 1980s and 1990s than with these curators who I think are not thinking so much about creativity in that way as putting forth their own individuality as a master maker. I think the notion is much more one behind the scenes, where the curator is not a nameplate and doesn't get the credit for that kind of juxtaposition. I don't know if that... Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about your description of the nostalgia of these three characters, and especially Salis, and the way that it seems like his nostalgia and then the modern version of Verne seem like sort of two sides of the coin of modernism. So at the end, when you talked about the new kind of installation as being about producing the modern subject who's disciplined and organized and directed and sort of will pay attention and follow that ideology, then it seems like Salis is all about the kind of the other side of modernism. I was struck by how you said that he thought the Boymans Museum made it too easy, because modernism is supposed to be hard. I mean, like abstraction is hard, and you don't, you have to figure it out. And this whole notion of sensation and play and freedom, I mean, partly, yes, it's a nostalgia for the past, but it also seems to be very much inside the, a certain kind of ideology of modernism, especially abstract painting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good observation. I think what interested me was that all three of these curators, coming from very different sensibilities and political positions, actually share a sensibility in some way about this. So, I fully agree. It lines up on a kind of modernist axis with those two, but I was hoping to cut across a little bit a certain way of characterizing modernism to make it a little bit more, paint a little bit more complicated picture of the politics and the aesthetic sensibilities of these three figures who are coming, from very different points of view, but whose sensibility about this is in some ways worth comparing.
Quick question over here, way up in the cheap seats. You mentioned this as part of a book. Can you share with us your idea for the book and how this fits into the bigger picture if you're at that stage? Or
Sure. It's a short book, and it's about the Louvre in the 1930s, primarily René Huyghe, and then it follows through to after the war, looking in a more detailed way than I was able to here, the use of reproductive photographs, the notions of those, but it also looks at the films that the Louvre commissions in the 30s, and Huyghe helps direct some of these, one in particular about Rubens that wins awards. And so I'm interested in the way that these, they're basically shorts that were shown on the Champs-Élysées, were engineered again to suggest ways of looking and viewing to be brought into the museum.
Hi, I don't remember you're saying anything about the labeling of works of art, and I don't remember seeing. I just thought of it now, but in this picture, of course, I don't see labels. It seems to me that in addition to the concerns about different ways of seeing and experiencing art, that there, in the 20th century, maybe changes in how people cultivate knowledge about art, and how the experts on art try to get the public to cultivate a knowledge of art. So I'm wondering, one, when did the labeling start next to each painting in the Louvre or elsewhere, as far as you know? And also, is there any correlation of the arrangement of the paintings with changes in the pedagogy of art history?
Pedagogy and content, right? The labeling question is one that's very fraught in the 30s, and this exhibition that Huyghe puts on in 1937 has documentary panels which provide information about technique and the like, mainly through quotations from the artist, and photographs. And it's just hard to imagine. This was hugely controversial to have that kind of introduction to an art show. And much to Huyghe's surprise, he shouldn't have been surprised, but he apparently was. It was very much embraced by the socialist and communist as a model exhibition because of its pedagogical intentions and its clarity, and totally trashed on the other side of politics. So after the war, the Louvre puts many more of these documentary panels around the controversy about mixing text and objects and labeling and trying to be didactic in that sense subsides some. Of course, you could walk through with these these guides.
I forgot about the guide, yeah.
But to have it on the wall is another thing. In the Louvre, I mean, it's different, where you look, right? At which museums you're looking at in the 30s. The Museum of Modern Art has text tacked to the wall by Alfred Barr without much shame.
How specific might this have been to France? I'm thinking specifically of the Barnes Foundation as a comparison, and the kind of formalism of objects and various paintings amongst one another that are not historically grounded. And you mentioned Bergson specifically as a kind of philosophical marker to it, and I wonder if there are examples in international art exhibition that you might talk about comparatively with this.
Yeah, I mean, the various museums, this is a little bit different than the Barnes Foundation in that it's not juxtaposing metal work or non-European objects. So the intention in these exhibitions, I would want to distinguish from what's going on at the Barnes. But yeah, to be sure, there are, in Essen and at the Folkwang Museum, there are juxtapositions of so-called primitive objects with modern objects and with a sensibility that's somewhat like the Barnes, although the Barnes is very, very weird in its way. I mean, Evelyn has written quite interestingly about Matisse's fondness for the Barnes Foundation. For a short time, you're right, right.
Was different from the old-fashioned presentation in American museums at the time, which was very pompous, with velvet covers, flower pots, it was not at all the Louvre presentation that was in the Met or whatever. So he liked the Barnes jumble, but of course for a short time. And Barnes had a pedagogical idea. But it was the wrong pedagogy. It was like he wanted to force everyone to see the work exactly the way he saw it, because that was the only way.
Right. No, it's very different, I think, than this kind of attempt to be fluid and open and associative. Even though, when you look at the installation, if you look at a picture of one installation over and against another without historical knowledge of intention or reception, they can look very much the same or very similar. And that's part of, I think, for me, what's interesting about it is trying to tease out those differences.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was struck by I think you did cut through several things. For someone like me, educated in France and all that, the idea of associating three names like Salle, Georges Salle, Germain Bazin was a collaborator, and René Huyghe was, when I was a student, he was an arch, It's so strange, because Salle is a kind of, hero, Bazin is a creep.
I know.
So it's like, it's very, very, you certainly cut through at least a political divide.
I to be sure.
Yeah, I just have a quick question about the philosophical background of all this. It reminded me so much of the critique of judgment and Kant's characterization of aesthetic experience as being characterized by the free play of the imagination and of the faculties, and also by disinterestedness. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me the objection to the linear hang, do you call it, is that the curator is sort of forcing interestedness on you in where this will block, at least in Kant's sense, the possibility of aesthetic experience.
Yeah, and then the whole attempt to kind of force a certain, the whole notion that you could force a certain way of looking as opposed to something that would be natural and innate, right, is also very un-Kantian.
I want to ask also something about it, which is related to the question of Pat Gary before. You know, when you make a multi-hang, you propose associations, but you also propose associations of a different kind when you make a single hang. It's not that a single hang is not easy to do for someone who does shows. You have to be careful of what you. So you make associations, and they're just far more linear, so to speak, but not completely anyway. And so it might be just a question of multiplication of links that you can do, rather than simply suppression. One is the suppression of the link. What's less is more unidirectional rather than multidirectional, but it's still pedagogical impulse in both cases.
Yeah, to be sure. I mean, what interests me though is that is just this moment where there is this reaction to the one-row hang, right? Because when I think about it historically, these men have something I will never be able to have, right? They look at a wall full of paintings without trying to imagine it on the other side of the one-row hang being normal. So this moment where the one-row hang, despite all its possibilities that have been exploited and were exploited then and since, right, seemed this way. And I find that quite, I guess what I want is their vantage point as someone who works in the 19th century to look back from.
Very briefly, it seems to me that there is a conceptual moment that comes before the hanging. In other words, the works in a single hang, you have already chosen the works. There are just a few, and you have chosen them. The second step is hanging them. You already have what you're going to work with. That decision has been made.
Right. So is that an observation or a question or?
Well, it's a different kettle of fish when you have 65 things that you're dealing with that you already have, and then another conceptual start is choosing 7 or 8. It's a very much more condensed situation of arrangement.
Yes, absolutely. Right, if you're thinking about it from the point of view of the curator, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
I guess I just also like to ask, related to that, do they ever talk about a sort of practical problem, which is the problem of storage? As you strip down these paintings, where do you put them? And then, again, relatedly, is there a kind of sadness that some paintings will never be on view personally, but also that they then become sort of closed down to a public who presumably won't view the unchosen pieces, the pieces that never make it. Do they ever talk about those issues?
Yeah, and in this period after World War I and before World War II, there are numerous museums that prune their collections and create more streamlined installations and then create study galleries of a sort, right, where the less renowned works can be seen. So they're compromise steps. But what I've been particularly interested in, obviously, at the Louvre is the sense of what happens for the mass public when you create that sort of situation. But yeah, there is a sense that, in fact, Philadelphia is a very interesting museum in the 30s where there are a lot of period rooms, and then there's spare installations, but you can also, as a 2-story museum, go downstairs if something has interested you, and then there's study collections there. And Louis Hautecoeur, who's a French museologist designs plans that are like this as well.
That's a bit the same at the National Gallery in London, where you could go down and until very recently, see kind of storage type installation, floor to ceiling installation in the basement of the National Gallery in London. That's what the first time I saw it. That's where I remember it. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think that we should let you have a drink. We are all invited to a reception, full hall, across the lawn.
Yeah, thank you for your patience.